You're listening to The Foundation of Wellness, a refreshing take on diet and lifestyle. Join me, Marisa Moon, as we tackle modern health with innovative and ancient principles. I'm a certified primal health coach and intermittent fasting instructor at marisamoon.com. Hey out there, it's me, Marisa Moon, your host. I'm wondering how many of you are keeping up with podcasts right now during this time of social isolation, quarantine from the coronavirus outbreak. You are still listening to this show, obviously, if you're hearing me right now, and that means everything to me. I have to tell you, I work hard to get you this content every week. I'm struggling in my own way. My husband works in the emergency room. This coronavirus thing is not going to be leaving the front of my mind for long, but the podcast is really a big part of my life, and just seeing how many of you are listening helps show me that this is something that's of value to you still, even during this time. So thank you for being here and for any efforts that you make to share this show with other people. Anyone that you think would like the foundation of wellness or needs a little bit of encouragement in the area of nutrition and healthy living, please send them this show and show them how to listen to a podcast. Anyone can find various apps with the foundation of wellness at the link podkite.link/FOW. Remember that FOW is for the foundation of wellness. And an even easier way to get someone into podcasts is they can just go to marisamoon.com/podcast, because all of the podcast players are right there, so they don't even need an app to listen to podcasts. And you know as well as I do, I'm sure, but I've been listening while I clean or cook or just relax, because usually I would listen to podcasts on my commute. But now I'm getting more creative. I'm doing it while I'm folding laundry or while I'm relaxing and trying not to watch TV. So those are just a few ideas of how you can fit it into your life more. And especially if you have a treadmill or you're exercising at home, I really love this when I'm doing some low intensity workouts. So thanks for being here. And today is such an amazing interview. I feel so blessed to have this guest on here today. Dallas Hartwig is on the show today to talk about the concepts in his new book called The 4-Season Solution, the groundbreaking new plan for feeling better, living well, and powering down our always-on lives. We talk about small yet significant lifestyle changes that we can make in accordance with the seasons and our biological needs. And we get into some conversation about the typical midlife crisis, as well as how this quarantine time we're being forced into living is perfectly matched up with the contents of this book. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Dallas. He's the co-founder of the Whole30 and Whole9 programs. I'm sure you've heard of the Whole30, right? Amazing and life-changing diet and program right there. He's the co-author of New York Times bestsellers It Starts With Food and the Whole30. Dallas is a functional medicine practitioner and physical therapist, and he's also the co-host of the Living Experiment podcast. He's been featured in the media all over, like Good Morning America, The Dr. Oz Show, Today, The View, a lot more than that too. You can always find out more about Dallas at dallashartwig.com. And this book, Dallas just published, The 4-Season Solution, teaches us how to live in sync with the more natural world so that we can learn to pause and appreciate more dynamics of life and achieve deeper fulfillment, better health, and a grounded purpose. I know that sounds like a bunch of wishful thinking to some people, and maybe you think you've heard it before, but this is different. It's deep, yes, but it's wise. It's totally human, and most of us are missing out today. Not long ago, our ancestors lived according to the changing seasons, adjusting how they slept and ate and moved and even socialized throughout the year. But today, we are more disconnected from the natural world than ever. Most of us today have lives that are constantly stressful, endlessly busy, and exhausting. By making small but meaningful changes to the 4 key areas of wellness, how we sleep, for instance, eat, move, and connect, throughout the changing seasons in a year, we can reclaim our health and our energy and inner peace. It really helps us to find balance that we all need so badly. I am all about this. I hope you're going to listen to this interview to the end. It's such a special one that I hope you're ready to receive. And there's really no better time than right now. Here we go. Hey, Dallas, it really is such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. I know things are crazy for everyone right now, but you're also out and about on this virtual book tour and have lots going on to get the word out about the Four Seasons solution. So having your time here is even more valuable than ever.
Well, I'm happy to do it. And, it's sort of a strange time, but as you and I were just talking about offline, I think this book, even though, of course, I had no indication that there would be a global pandemic, I think this book is more timely than ever before. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Oh, it's crazy how I practically got chills reading some of the sections of your book at this time, thinking this is what people need right now. I mean, I don't know if it's for everyone. I just know everyone needs it. I couldn't help but wondering, like, how do you know who's ready for this book? And if they have the time to really dig deep, like your book suggests, this is just what we all need right now.
Well, I'm glad to hear that that really resonated with you as you were reading through it. And I think one of the things that I wrote into the book is both a really sort of low-hanging fruit, easy entry point, and then also as much sort of self-paced philosophical exploration as the reader wants over time. And so there's a place where you can start with like the most basic health behaviors around food and sleep and movement and social connections, and then you can think about it on longer, multi-year and multi-decade timelines. So it's a sort of a self-guided adventure for the reader.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I see it as one of those books that you could really go back to so many times because you give so many examples, and the comparisons of seasons in a day or a year or a lifetime that you make throughout that book, it almost seems repetitive, but until you stop for a moment to really soak in like what you're teaching us, you realize that the complexity, but like the poetic nature of the entire concept is very real. It's like lately I've been getting into understanding the phases of the moon or the woman's menstrual cycle. And if you really think about them seasonally, like you did in your book, you can see how interwoven it is into everything that we feel, experience, and strive for.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the key points that I make early in the book is that, early in the history of humankind around the agricultural revolution, so basically kind of when we first started leaving behind the hunter-gatherer lifestyles, which was present for most of our evolutionary history, once we started becoming more agricultural and industrialized, we started to get a long ways off track because we separated ourselves from the natural rhythms of the world, of biology. And those rhythms are still encoded into our bodies, but we've kind of flattened out and made everything kind of linear and binary. And that's not how we as organisms are, or any other organisms. We're used to oscillations. And so one of the key ideas is let's respect and honor and value some of those rhythms, those natural oscillations. And I'm glad to hear that you've been digging into that stuff too.
Mm-hmm. And what do you mean by oscillations? That's not really in my vocabulary.
Yeah. So, an oscillation is really a movement either around something or between two poles. So, the moon orbiting around the Earth, or the Earth orbiting around the sun, or things that are kind of, you can think of a pendulum swinging back and forth would be an oscillation. And so, I I tend to get a little bit nerdy with my language, but really what we're talking about are rhythms and cycles. And that's everything from tides to, the light dark cycle across the course of the day, and to the different temperature changes across the course of a year. So all of those things are examples of oscillations.
And I do kind of hear that in the message of your book, in that you make us realize we can't just have all summer all the time, or we can't have, only fall and winter and inner work we won't appreciate that without the summer or the spring.
Right.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, and that's really the thing. And I kind of in the book talk about two primary phases, and then kind of it gets a little more complex within that. But the really simple way to think about it is that all life and our psyches themselves go through these expansion and contraction cycles. And if we are to be well balanced and sort of well functioning or well tuned as humans, we have to have a ratio, a relationship between the expansion and contraction phases. And that's expansion sort of physically. And you think about if you are, let's say you're on a camping trip and it's dark, you wake up in the morning. And as you get out and explore the world, as you kind of leave camp and maybe you go on a hike or a boat trip or something, the physical world gets bigger, and that's paralleled in our lifetimes. When we are infants and children, our physical world is quite small, but then as we become adolescents and young adults and we start to travel and we start to expand, physically kind of our world expands, but also intellectually and emotionally our world expands. We meet new people, we come across new ideas, we encounter new cultures, we go to different parts of the world. And so there is this expansion phase that occurs every day, every year, and in the early part of our life. And that needs to be balanced by the contraction phase. So spring and summer sort of symbolically would be part of the expansion, and fall and winter would be part of the contraction, of the restoring, of the coming home and reconnecting. But civilization got stuck in expansion, and we are all about dopamine and adrenaline and stress and stimulation and novelty and reward and excitement and fun and pleasure and happiness. And all of that stuff is wonderful, but it is only one half of the story and one side of the coin. And when we get stuck in what I call chronic summer, the behaviors neurochemically, hormonally, metabolically that go with that mean that we end up very unbalanced, very stressed. And, as many people are really understanding, chronic stress and chronic inflammation really are at the root of almost all chronic disease. So I say chronic summer produces chronic disease. And the hopefully obvious thing there is that we need to leave behind that chronic summer behavior in favor of naturally moving through all of the different phases, so that we don't just have the sort of metabolic adaptations to one specific seasonal way of being. Hopefully that makes sense.
Well, it makes sense to me because I read the book, but I wrote down a little metaphor you made about chronic summer living, because you talk a lot about chronic summer living in the book, and it makes sense because we're all living this crazy, busy, hectic, modern lifestyle. And you said we've overdrafted our bank accounts. That's how you could think about chronic summer living. Like we've overspent our emotional energy, our waking hours, our physical health, and our mental bandwidth are just overused. And to get ourselves out of the red, we need a period of restoration where we build up our psychological and physiological savings, in quotes. The pivot to fall or autumn is like what we're being forced to deal with right now, is what I was thinking. It's like right now, we are being forced in social isolation or quarantine. And you talk about the pivot to fall as such an important phase. It's like leaving summer and taking a moment to like assess everything and think about where you're at and question things. And we never do that. It's like we just all year long are in chronic summer living.
Totally. And it's interesting because you make a really great point, is that we are being kind of forced into this contractive fall phase, even though it's technically spring in the Northern Hemisphere. The contraction phase will feel a lot more natural for people living in the Southern Hemisphere right now, because they're going into fall anyway. So that contraction is going to feel a lot more natural. For those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, part of our brains are like excited. It's springtime. It's getting warmer. It's getting sunnier, or we're looking to, go do more stuff and to get outside more. And that's partially restricted in the way that we can do that, at least with the close social connections that we might have that go along with some of those activities. So I write into the book, and I forget exactly which chapter it's in now, but I write into the book about when you're implementing some of these recommendations, and I guess we should talk about some of those more specifically, but when we're starting implementing some of these recommendations, if you happen to pick up the book in the spring, like it is right now in the Northern Hemisphere, you don't have to throw yourself into a very, tightly contracted fall and then winter kind of restorative darkness, sleep, hibernation kind of mode, because that's going to feel really counterintuitive in the spring and summer. And so what we can do is we can introduce a little more of a sort of stepwise, sort of longer term movement towards this fall contraction kind of experience. And actually this works out quite well, because what I say in the book is you don't have to do this all at once. You don't have to totally upend the way that you live. And you can do this in the very accessible stepwise way. So now in the spring, we can do some of those things of slowing down. And because there are these different timelines, what I call fractal patterns, but there are different, the patterns that occur on different timelines. And so not only do we want to slow down and feel more grounded and connected and grateful and generous in the fall, sort of that Thanksgiving kind of feeling, which is such a hallmark of fall, but we also want to feel more of that as we sort of ease into the fall and winter of our lives. And for many of us who've not been honoring the seasons of our lives each year as they've gone by, we kind of need to go into this sort of therapeutic healing, sort of this offset kind of mode. And so actually, yeah, right now actually would be a great time to slow down, to rest, to heal, to manage our stress, to connect with the people that are most important to us, to nourish our bodies. And that's really what fall is so much about. And so this sort of strange blip in the world right now gives us the opportunity to do that on a large collective basis, which I think is really a blessing in disguise.
Yeah, and it makes sense ancestrally, even though it's not literally the season that we're in. I mean, think about the things our ancestors had to go through, like war and the Great Depression, or, crazy droughts and circumstances that would just change everything that they were in rhythm with. And I think that now we are being forced into this, and you see all over the internet from people who've never even spoken this way before. They're like, oh, I feel like this is all happening for a reason. I feel like I really needed this, or me and my family really needed this. And, maybe that we say that to ourselves to get us through it. But I think like instinctively we know, holy cow, I could not have kept up that pace for so long.
Right. And that's really the feeling that we have. And again, going back to this concept of chronic summer, the experience of being exhausted and overstimulated and overwhelmed and kind of just frazzled and frayed, that's the feeling that we often get at the end of the literal summer, right? We're thinking about slowing down. We're looking forward to the days getting a bit shorter. Maybe we're sending the kids back to school. Maybe we're doing less in the way of like road trips or outdoor activities. And we're just thinking about, it'll be good to settle. And that's the experience that so many of us have. And we have that not just each year, but we have that sometimes for years and years and years on end, because we're living as if it's summertime all year round. Yeah. And what I mean by that is we're living, in terms of the light dark cycle, in terms of the, sleep and wake cycle. In the summertime, the days are long, the nights are relatively short, and we get less sleep. And that's totally okay and totally biologically normal and not harmful. I think this is an interesting point. Is that it's not harmful to get less sleep in the summertime. And, we're increasingly recognizing in the research how important and how harmful chronic sleep restriction is, chronic sleep loss is. But I argue that short-term sleep restriction, like you'd have in the summertime, where you're staying up till 10 or 11 or midnight or whatever, is actually biologically normal. But it's only normal for the short months in the middle of the summer. It's not normal when we use artificial light to make that same pattern of lots of light, not very much darkness year round. And that's where we run into trouble. So what I'm arguing for is that our light dark cycle in the summertime looks much like the natural light outside, and that pattern of matching up the natural environment outside to our own light dark exposure should continue season after season after season, which means going into the fall and then even more going into the winter, we have a lot more darkness and very dim light. And, we know from a sort of physiological standpoint that blue wavelengths, blue light really disrupts our circadian rhythms. It really disrupts the way our brain is able to wind down and get into a deep restorative sleep mode. And the reason for that is that blue light to our bodies means blue sky, midday, pay attention, be alert. Like, you have to kind of be on. And it's the exact opposite messages we want to be sending our bodies in the evenings as we're winding down. So there's lots of kind of things that change seasonally, but that light dark cycle there and the chronic sleep restriction is a classic example of how behaving as if it's summer all the time and not getting very much sleep really starts to erode our health over the course of time.
Yeah, I mean, this is an important topic to me, and I know it is to you, and you wrote about it a lot in your book. You talk about sleep and light a lot, and thank you for that, because I learned so much, and I will continue to learn so much in your book. But I personally went through a bout of chronic fatigue, and I also have a husband who's worked the night shift for so many years. Mm-hmm. And so not until I hit like rock bottom and literally like could not stand up for sustained periods of time, or like even hold my own body weight because I was so chronically exhausted. Even though I was sleeping like 9.5, 10 hours a night, I just wasn't going into deep sleep. But
right.
Until I started learning about sleep and trying to figure out why the hell I was so tired, because I was so desperate to, I wasn't ready for this type of information. And I feel like most people, I see this with so many of my clients, they are not ready to talk about sleep and not ready to accept that the light is really affecting them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, part of that, and I'll take, not responsibility per se, but, many of us who've been in sort of health education for a long time, we used to think diet and exercise, diet and exercise, diet and exercise. Mm-hmm. And the more I read and the more I learn, and I wrote this into the book as well, the more I appreciate, it's not just sleep, because sleep matters more than we used to think it did, but also, and even more, and this is one of the kind of newer ideas in the book that I haven't seen written about elsewhere, is that it's not just sleep itself. It's actually our exposure to light and our exposure to darkness, or the absence of light. And because we have a sort of a daytime light physiology and we have a darkness night physiology. And when we skew that in favor of light and bright and daytime, if you think about sleep as this active restorative time, because we used to think about sleep decades ago as this relatively passive inert state where we kind of closed our eyes and effectively turned out the lights and nothing happened and we woke up the next morning. But really, sleep is this incredibly active time where we are doing metabolic repair processes, and we are doing detoxification processes and digestive processes, and we are building neurotransmitters and hormones and enzymes. Like, sleep is a profoundly active restorative state. And if we're not recovering from the stress and activity of the previous day, over the course of time, we are overdrafting that bank account. But there's more than just the actual sleep time. There's the time spent in darkness that allows us to take a reprieve from the stress and stimulation of light itself. And I say stress in this case in the sort of literal sense, not in the harmful stress way, but just in the stimulation that sort of brings us to, it sort of keeps us alert, keeps us engaged in the world. And in that sense, stress is something that is stimulating and engaging and productive. But over the course of time, when it's not repaired and when it's not balanced with adequate time in darkness and time spent asleep, we run into trouble. And that's when we get into the kind of chronic fatigue, chronic inflammation, depression, anxiety, insomnia sort of situations. And then it's heart disease and it's diabetes and, all of that stuff that goes with that. So I think there's a fairly direct line between the behaviors of summer and chronic disease. And for me, that's exciting, because if people start doing some of these basic behaviors, and they're relatively simple shifts for the most part, we can prevent a huge amount of tragic and painful chronic disease outcomes. And we can also help people to reverse the situations that they're currently in. So chronic fatigue is a great example, but everything from, inflammatory skin conditions. I mentioned depression and anxiety already. So many different things can be massively impacted simply by making some of these lifestyle shifts. And we know this, like we know that lifestyle matters. We know diet and exercise matters. And then when I layer on how much light and darkness matters and how much the way that we connect socially with the other people, with ourselves, with a sense of belonging and place and connection to the earth. And then kind of last but not least, the sense of connection to a sense of purpose, to something bigger than ourselves. All of a sudden, with those basic pieces in place, we have this sort of psychological and emotional bandwidth to do so much more big, beautiful things in our lives than just survive. So I think one of the motivations for me in writing this book was to give people really pragmatic resources so they didn't have to spend their entire lives trying to figure out how to be healthy and miss the rich, vibrant experience of being a human.
Oh man, that's a good quote right there. I moved to like the woods in rural Indiana, just outside of Chicago. And I used to live downtown Chicago for who knows how long. And I was such a city girl. Like I thought I would never leave the city. And all of a sudden, like on my primal journey, I was like, this is crazy. I need to be in nature. Something's wrong with me. And just moving to this type of atmosphere, I was more appreciative of the seasons. And this is a regular conversation my husband and I would have because he's from Hawaii. He lived there his whole life throughout college. And he's like, had a hard time adjusting to our winter. We're in the Midwest, it's freezing. But we both realized, because we live in the woods, how incredible each season is. And I personally just love fall and winter because it always gave me an excuse to like hibernate and just stay home and do inner work. And your book is like totally singing to me in that way because I've known I need that balance. Otherwise I will straight up lose my cool and lose my mind. And I think that your upbringing is so unique and makes you really prepared for this type of philosophical, intervention. And I don't think a lot of people come from that perspective. If they don't have an experience like mine or like yours, or a time in their life where nature played a really big role in their completeness or their happiness, I think it's hard for them to take this kind of like deep leap into something that's so, I don't know, just deep. It's like can you tell our audience a little bit about how you spent some time off the grid in your childhood and what that was like?
Sure. I mean, my parents in the mid 1970s decided they wanted to kind of distance themselves from what they viewed as kind of a crazy, hectic modern world. They grew up in Greater Toronto, in Ontario, Canada. And they left the city and they bought 100 acres of property at the end of a dead-end dirt road in eastern Ontario. And on the property was essentially a rundown log cabin that had no electricity and no running water. And that's where they lived when I was born. And we stayed there until I was 5, and we moved closer to town so I could go to school. But that was the first 5 years of my life, was living in that space. And, we used candles and oil lamps for light. And, we had to heat up our water on the stove, whether it was for, a bath or, for cooking. And so there was this slowness and this quality of being really connected to the natural rhythms of the earth, because when it got dark outside and you have an oil lamp or a candle, there isn't a lot of stress and stimulation, and the world gets very small and very quiet. And I really think that I really grew to appreciate that. I mean, of course, I was a child, so I wasn't thinking about any of this, but in my own journey coming back to this place and really honoring more of those natural rhythms in myself, there is this familiarity that that when we are sort of in sync, in harmony with what's going on in the natural environment around us, it is a peaceful, grounded, connected, healing place. And if there's anything that we need in the modern world, especially at this moment where there's so much kind of craziness going on, that connection to ourselves and to our closest people, our inner circle, or what I call our anchor connections, those connections, those or reconnections, because we've often lost that along the way, are profoundly important. And when we can slow down and when we can step away from the stimulation of social media and, the fast moving everything, the news media, even, when we can just sort of slow down and, you're saying that you kind of live, in the woods, when you notice what's going on in the natural world, including that it's getting colder outside, that it's getting darker earlier, and you can honor those same experiences in yourself, all of a sudden, I noticed that you mentioned that you used the word excuse. It gave you an excuse to do inner work and to slow down. And isn't that so telling? Because we have built a world, a civilization where we have to look for excuses. We have to look for justifications to other people why we need to do the things that feel deeply and intuitively healing. And I think, it was a really interesting phrase that you used, because it's such a common experience. It's an experience that I myself have, that I have to sort of almost justify to people why I don't always do the things that everyone else around me does. Because we're so expected to be fast moving and working hard and chasing success and productivity and making more money and getting a raise and having another car. And those are just not the things that make us deeply happy. And I don't mean happy in the sort of joyful, ecstatic kind of happy. I mean, grounded and peaceful and rooted and feeling really safe. And that's just so much the experience of going home, and, whether that is home at the end of the day or whether that is kind of home back to your hometown or back to your parents' home. But it's the sort of experience of Thanksgiving, right? Which is, of course, in the fall. And that is the reconnection to things that matter to us most: family, home, belonging, gratitude, generosity. And if there's anything that the world needs now, it's that experience.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, you offer an example in the book to help depict what happens when we don't stop ever to take stock of our life or our circumstances or purposely slow down. And you compare it to the midlife crisis. Can you just explain what you believe the midlife crisis represents?
Sure. The midlife crisis, and there's, of course, no correct way to explain this. And of course, it's going to be different for everyone. But I understand, and I'm kind of in that midlife range myself. But I kind of understand the midlife crisis, as we stereotypically think of it, as a mismatch between the choices we've been making in our lives and the deep yearnings that are in us. And when we have that mismatch, that tension, and especially when it stretches out for, longer and longer over time, we start to feel really ill at ease, and we start to have yearnings to break free of the life that we've built for ourselves and the constraints. And whether that is career choices or family or where we live or how we've spent our money, whatever, we often feel very constrained because there is that mismatch. So when I think about the seasons of our lives, spring is that, youth and adolescence and even young adulthood, where it is all about dopamine and stimulation and fun and excitement and novelty and expanding into the world. And that expansion concept moves into the summer of our lives, which is sort of the late 20s, 30s, and early 40s, and where we are like full-time summer mode. It's go time. We are working hard. We are growing our careers. We are maybe having families. We are like doing the thing. And that's the time we are young and energetic, and like we're sort of pouring ourselves out to do the thing or multiple things. And it's why so many of us kind of lose touch with ourselves and feel so overwhelmed and overstimulated and exhausted during that time. And that's a relatively common and perhaps even normal feeling during those hardworking years. The problem is that the way the world is set up is that we're expected to keep that pace up and perhaps even push harder into our 40s and 50s and up until we retire at 65 or whatever. And that's where the real mismatch gets highlighted, is in that sort of second half of our work years, because as I understand it, there is a transition period somewhere in our kind of mid 40s to maybe 50 where we should be thinking about things other than pushing hard, success, productivity, you kind of what I think of as like trying to wring out a sponge that's already dry. There's not much more to squeeze out of it. And so there should be a natural, and I feel this, I'm kind of in the early stages of feeling this myself. There should be a natural pivot out of that hard charging summer mode into a more somewhat slower. And so this is not a stark shift, right? This is the experience of taking your foot off the gas and slowly coasting and slowing down, but not stomping on the brake. It's just a gentle coasting. And so taking your foot off the gas really then starts to feel like slowing down out of a little bit less pressure, a little bit less demand on ourselves, and starting to think both about the future and about the past, because we are at that midlife time. And so we have this retrospective and prospective. We're kind of straddling both halves of our lives there. And we should be thinking about what our legacy is. What do we really care about? How do we give back to the community? How do we provide for the people that we care about and contribute to a better world? And that sense of like legacy and leadership and mentorship and giving back is a thing that a lot of us would like to be able to think about in our 40s and 50s. And usually for sort of social expectations and financial constraints can't do that. And I think that's really where we get stuck in this mismatch. And then we decide, screw it, I want to totally burn my career to the ground and start over and be an artist or, whatever. Like we have this, like, we're in the wrong place. It doesn't feel right anymore. And so that midlife crisis, even if we don't end up, leaving our relationship and starting a new career and moving to a different country, there are far less dramatic ways to experience that same crisis mismatch experience. And it makes people deeply unhappy. And sometimes they feel so hemmed in by the constraints they've created that they don't even know how to get out. So part of my recommendations on pivoting to fall and exiting chronic summer have to do with honoring those deep intuitions that are already in all of us.
Man, I just imagine if somebody's listening, let's say a parent is listening right now who's in their 40s and maybe they still have young children, families are starting later and later. And they're like, are you kidding me? I still have student loans of my own. I have to send my kid to college and I, have a business that still hasn't gotten profitable yet and blah, 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 blah. They have a million things. They're like, how would that even look? You're saying take your foot off of the gas just slowly and start coasting. So like, give us a few examples of what somebody might do reasonably when all they've been doing is summer living.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question and certainly a difficult question to provide a perfect answer for, because the world we live in, the modern civilized world, has all of these constraints built into it. Think about, what we have to do, how hard we have to work to make enough money to support our families, to support ourselves, to pay off our student loans, to buy a home, like to do all the things that we think we have to do. And so on one hand, I say, just, take your foot off the gas and kind of slow down a bit. But on the other hand, I absolutely recognize that that's just not a thing that a lot of people can do, because the civilized world, the modern world, is not built with that in mind. The civilized world is built with chronic summer in mind. And this sounds a little bit kind of, perverse, but the civilized world views individual humans as disposable, as sort of dispensable. And so we are expected to behave a certain way within societal norms and within financial constraints and just do the thing and just sort of basically do as we're told. And the problem is that produces a great deal of health problems, of dis-ease, and of unhappiness in people. And my podcast co-host and dear friend Pilar Gerasimo recently wrote a book called The Healthy Deviant. And in that, she talks about how far away we are as a society from being in a healthy place, and how if each of us as individuals want to reclaim our health now and going forward, we need to be willing and able to deviate considerably from the societal norms, because our current society is not producing healthy, happy people. We don't have to look very far to see that. So part of the answer to your question is do what we can to to spend money differently, so we don't have such intense financial demands. Many people know me from my work in writing about food over the last decade, and I fielded thousands of questions, many of which are about the financial constraints of eating healthy food in this modern world. And people will often say, but eating, naturally raised, naturally fed, sustainable, organic food is too expensive. I can't afford it. And if I'm feeling particularly wise-ass that day, I'll sort of say, well, how much is your car payment? How much do you spend on your smartphone every month or your cable TV? And that's a little bit of a sharp answer, admittedly, but really what I'm getting at is that it's not so much that people can't afford healthy food, it's that they prioritize other things instead. And if you've got an $80 cell phone bill and a $400 car payment and a $100 cable TV package, what you're saying to me is not healthy food is too expensive, I can't afford it. What you're saying is adhering to societal norms and having all of those things that I have to pay every month is more important to me than prioritizing healthy food.
Yeah, and that's why I think people just wait until they hit rock bottom or until their doctor tells them, hey, we're going to have to amputate your foot, or they tell them, you are going to be on this medication for the rest of your life. Or they're like me and they have chronic fatigue and they literally can't even go to work. That's when they're finally willing to prioritize these things. And I wish there was some way that we can get more people to care before it's too late, or it's never too late really in the context of the book and the lessons that you teach. But I mean, before it gets to be so hard that you're that desperate, because there are these small changes, like the things we're talking about are very big, but there are small things like just practicing saying no, or like your family, you decided one Christmas you weren't going to get each other gifts. And for me, that sounded like something that my family and I need to try sometime, because we freaking love each other so much and just want to shower each other with a million gifts. Like even when we put caps on how much we're going to spend, we all spend triple that because we just get so excited. But it's also like way too big of an Italian family. So I'm buying for like 30 people, even when I'm just trying to buy for the kids and like really trying to be frugal, it ends up being totally unmanageable. And I think that if me and my immediate family one year took a break from that and instead just did something special, like cook together, we all love cooking so much, or something, gosh, I would experience a holiday in a way that I haven't experienced in so long. And it would just take some of that speed and pressure out of the hectic modern holiday. And those types of things I feel like are what you are hinting at when someone is realizing they are not tapping into what their life purpose is, or they're just in the rat race and they don't feel great about it, but they don't know what to do besides go skydiving.
Right. Well, I think that you make a great point there, because what often happens, and this was certainly my experience for many, many years, is I was like, this doesn't feel good, but I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make it feel better. And, the 4-season solution is not a quick fix. Here's how you make it better prescription. It is a new paradigm and perhaps even a new lens to view your entire life through, so that you can build it in a way that does feel good for you. Because I don't know what that is. I don't know how you should live. I don't know what yearnings you have to do differently than you're currently doing. But with some time and space and quietude and introspection, you can know those things. And when you can know those things, then you have the opportunity to start making some changes and implementing some of those changes. And that's really what I champion. I mean, my work with the Whole30 was intended to give people tools to figure out what dietary approaches work best for them. It's not a prescription of what people should eat. It is an opportunity for people to learn about themselves. And that same principle is deeply embedded in the 4-season solution as well. And so where you're at in your life and what certain behaviors are going to feel best for you are like, you're the only person that's going to know that. So I think what I'm really calling for and really championing here is to notice and recognize that you have the wisdom and self-knowledge within you. It's available to you of what you need to do differently. It's not something that you need to look to a guru or health expert or teacher somewhere else. And that includes not looking to me for the answer. I'm saying, hey, let me just hold up a little mirror here for you and say, actually, your deep intuitions are correct for you. And if things don't feel right, now is the time to start acknowledging that, so that you don't get to a place when you're 50 and you just hate everything about your life and you just burn it all down because you don't know what else to do. I mean, that's what the midlife crisis is. It's a eject button because we don't know what else to do because it's felt so bad for so long. Yeah. So if we start honoring what each of the different seasons of our lives should look like for us as individuals, we don't ever get to that point where there is this dramatic, painful mismatch between what we yearn for and what we're actually living. And I think there's a beautiful opportunity for each of us to have much more grounded, peaceful, harmonious lives within ourselves. And of course, when we feel peaceful and grounded within ourselves, that just spills out onto the people around us. And I think that's the way the world gets better.
Yeah. And there's this awesome thing that happens with any of the changes that you make for your health and your mental well-being and such, that the more you do something, the more you want to do it. And that can be good or bad, because the more TV you watch, the more TV you want to watch. The longer you've gone without TV, the less you want to watch TV. And sure. It happens with everything. It's like the more you, stay up late, the more you feel like that's what you want. And when someone tells you to go to bed earlier, or that you'll feel better if you don't, you probably come up with all these reasons why that's your time and that's your jam and that's what, something you don't want to give up. And I don't know, I wonder why that is, but it's the same thing with healthy eating. I tell people, you don't like vegetables now, but you start eating a little bit more and more and more, you'll start to crave them. It's crazy how you literally change your biology in a way to, like, it even happens with solitude. Let's face it. If you're used to being around people all the time, it's going to feel weird to say no or stay home by yourself. But if you are used to staying home all the time by yourself, then it just doesn't feel like you want to go out and socialize. So the seasons are just so important because they all help you appreciate one of the next, and they introduce your physiology to the important other phases that they oscillate with. I don't know if that's the right word, but
no, totally. And that's exactly right. And I love what you're saying there. Because in the ancient world, right, in the natural world, when we were kind of pre-civilization hunter-gatherers, we had these external cues, whether it is light, dark, or change in temperature, or different food availability, different times of year. We had these external cues to behave differently. And now, as we don't have so much of that because we have artificial light and temperature-controlled buildings and, time-controlled schedules and food availability that's pretty much the same all across the year. And in a world that's so automated and mechanized that we don't really have to do much in the way of physical activity to survive, we lack the external cues, the external prompts to do things differently. So we have to actually recognize the lack of that in the modern world and actually reintroduce that on purpose now. And, to your point about kind of things having sort of a habitual pattern, I see this a ton, whether it is with the type of exercise that we do or our sleep patterns or when we eat. I mean, something that I observed many years ago with people who decide to do different fasting protocols is they would tend to wake up in the morning, have their coffee, and say, I'm not really hungry right now. I don't want to eat. Well, one of the things that happens when you have a caffeinated beverage, especially one that if you add fat to it, is you start to suppress the satiety signaling. And so you end up at this place where you're like, I'm not hungry. Well, part of the reason you might not be hungry is because you're eating fat and you're in a caffeinated state. And that might be fine for part of the year, but the problem is this goes on for a really long period of time. And so when we push our feeding windows, when we push the time that we eat back and we don't eat till lunchtime or into the afternoon, then we try to eat all of our meal or all of our calories in the late part of the day, our digestive system, including all of the hormone signaling that goes with that, things like leptin, start to adjust to that pattern. And then we say, I do better when I eat in the evening, and I don't really like breakfast. I don't really want to eat early in the day. And I observe that as just your hormonal response adjusting to what you've done before. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's what you should do. it feels right because it's an adaptation to what you've been doing. And I think that's an important distinction. And so when I challenge people to say, oh, okay, I'm totally on board. This is me with clients in the past. I'm totally on board with you continuing to do a fasting because it seems to work really well for you. But I challenge you, eat a really big protein-rich breakfast within an hour of waking, a good size lunch. And if you eat a dinner, do it quite early at 4, 5, 6 p.m. and then don't eat anything containing any calories for the rest of the night. And people really hate that idea, partly because it changes. It's the exact inverse of what they're used to. So yeah, there's very much this inertia effect of of the way our bodies adapt to the external inputs that we give it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's the way we should do it. So you brought up a great point, and I think it's a good example.
Yeah, definitely. Early time restricted eating is something that makes a lot of sense biologically and definitely helps with our sleep. And it just culturally, it doesn't really work that well for a lot of families. But the older people get, I've noticed my clients that are around 50 and up, they really love that early time restricted eating schedule. And it depends on the season, that makes a lot of sense in the winter. But in the summer, we should be a lot more relaxed with that and ingesting more calories and more carbohydrates that are from nature, like fruits. And I know we're getting close to an hour here, so I want to wrap up soon, and I appreciate so much your time. And I wanted to say, for anyone that's still listening to this episode, that book is really so appropriate for this time right now. I would love for you to pick up the 4 Seasons Solution. If there's any part of you that knows that you should be more in touch with nature or find deeper meaning and purpose in your life, or if there's something that you feel like you haven't achieved with your health and you're wondering why because you think you're doing everything right, or if you and your emotional connections with your family are maybe a little bit off and you just feel like you're not sure what you could possibly do better. Anyone that grew up with farming in their past or fishing or nature, and you kind of remember that, but you feel so out of touch with it, this book would be so great for you. And a quote that Dallas wrote in there says at the end of the book, he said, "This has been a book about pausing and engaging in more disciplined behavior so we can better appreciate and savor life, ultimately achieving optimal health." And a lot of us have the time right now for maybe the only time we're going to be forced into this type of scenario. So why not take this time to really do the inner work, or even consider something like this that no one else is really going to bring to us? We have to go out and seek it.
Well, that is a beautiful summary. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to send people somewhere where they can be in touch with you and communicate
Sure.
more?
Yeah. So my website, DallasHartwig.com. That's HARTWIG.com. I'm also active on Instagram at Dallas Hartwig. I do less on Facebook and Twitter, although I'm there occasionally. But Instagram is kind of my primary place. And I've got an email newsletter, which I'd love for you to sign up for. I send out information there as well. And once we get past this time period of sort of social distancing and not doing as much travel, I'll be back out on the road doing speaking engagements. So if you subscribe to my email newsletter, you'll get notifications if I'm coming to your area as well.
And you have a podcast.
And I have a podcast. Thank you for reminding me. The Living Experiment podcast. And we hope we've got 100+ episodes there. My co-host is brilliant and amazing, and I'm very lucky to have a podcast with her. So I hope you'll join us somewhere.
Just following you on Instagram or following your podcast, I think people will get a real deep sense of who you are and learn a lot from you, because you like to just get us all thinking, and you're willing to be vulnerable, which I truly appreciate, because you say things that we either imagine, we need to say to ourselves, or that we might experience soon and we can learn from your experiences. And so I encourage everyone to follow him on Instagram or listen to The Living Experiment if you like that sort of deep thought direction that he likes to go in. So
thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So I will let you go, and thanks for being on the show.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Well, there you go. What an awesome episode it was. Thanks for listening till the end. I'm going to keep this short and wrap up. You can join me in the Foundation of Wellness Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/FOW podcast. Bye.